wind howled through the testing facility of Vanguard Aerospace. Jet engines roared, fuel fumes thick in the air. Ethan Cole knelt on the concrete floor, scrubbing a fuel stain with steady hands. A procession of executives passed overhead on the steel catwalk. Among them, Veronica Pierce, 32, CEO, heels clicking like gunshots. She glanced down, her voice slicing through the noise. "Careful there. Don't let your hands touch something you're not qualified to understand. Jets aren't for people who only know how to mop floors." Laughter erupted around her. Ethan stayed still, his eyes lifting toward the steel gleam of the fighter jet behind glass, the place where he once belonged. Veronica Pierce had inherited Vanguard Aerospace 6 months ago, when her father died of a heart attack in his corner office. She was brilliant, ruthless, and utterly convinced that weakness had no place in the sky. The board of directors watched her every move, waiting for her to stumble, to prove that a woman in her early 30s couldn't fill her father's shoes. So she became harder, colder. She fired underperformers without hesitation, cut budgets that didn't show immediate returns, and built walls around herself so high that even her own reflection felt like a stranger. To Veronica, the world was divided into 2 kinds of people: those who flew and those who fell. And once you fell, you didn't deserve to look up. She'd grown up watching her father command rooms, negotiate billion-dollar contracts, shake hands with generals and senators. He'd taught her that respect was earned through dominance, that sympathy was weakness dressed in pretty words. When he collapsed at his desk, clutching his chest, she wasn't there. She was in Tokyo closing a deal. She flew home to an empty office and a legacy she wasn't sure she could carry. The funeral was private. The press conference was flawless. And every night since, she stood in front of the mirror practicing her father's expression, the one that said nothing could break her. But something already had. Ethan Cole had fallen a long time ago. He was 35 now, but the scars on his back made him feel older. He'd been a fighter pilot in the Air Force, flying F-16 seconds with the Valor Squadron, a unit so elite that their missions were still classified. He'd flown over deserts and mountains, pulled maneuvers that defied physics, saved lives that would never know his name. Then came the mission in Nevada. His wingman's engine failed at 20,000 feet. Ethan broke formation, stayed with him, guided him down through a sandstorm that turned the sky into a wall of rage. They both survived. But Ethan's jet took shrapnel from ground fire on the way out. He ejected over the desert, spent 2 days in the sand before rescue came. The injury to his spine was severe enough to end his flying career. He was honorably discharged, given a medal he never wore, and sent back to a life that no longer fit. His wife, Sarah, had been his whole world. She died of cancer during his physical therapy, and he couldn't even hold her hand without shaking from the pain in his back. Now he lived in a small apartment with his 8-year-old daughter, Lila. She had her mother's smile and his love for the sky. Every night, he told her stories about flying, about the clouds that looked like mountains, and the stars that guided pilots home, but he never told her why he stopped. The medical bills had emptied his savings. The veteran benefits covered some, but not enough. So he took the only job he could find that didn't require standing for 12 hours janitorial work at Vanguard Aerospace. It was humiliating at first. Working in a place where he'd once been respected, where people like him had walked as legends. But then he realized something. Lila could come with him after school. She could sit in the corner and draw. She could breathe the same air as the machines that touched the sky. And that was enough. Lila would sit in the corner of the Vanguard hangar while he worked, sketching airplanes in a notebook she carried everywhere. Her drawings were surprisingly detailed. Engines, fuel lines, wing structures. A young engineer named Marcus noticed her once and spent 20 minutes explaining thrust-to-weight ratios while she nodded, absorbing every word. Ethan watched from a distance, mop in hand, and felt something crack open in his chest. This was why he stayed. Not for himself. For her. Veronica found Lila in the restricted testing zone on a Tuesday afternoon. The little girl was sitting cross-legged on the floor, holding a faded blueprint she'd found in a recycling bin. Her small fingers traced the lines carefully, her lips moving as she whispered the labels to herself. Veronica's heels announced her arrival, like a judge's gavel. The sound echoed off the steel walls, sharp and final. "Who let this child in here?" Her voice cut through the hum of machinery. Lila looked up, startled. Her eyes were wide, dark, innocent. I was just looking. This is a place for people who know how to fly, not people who dream." Veronica's eyes were sharp, her jaw set. She gestured to the prototype fighter behind the glass partition. "Do you know how much that costs? More than your house, more than your school, more than anything you'll ever touch in your life." Lila's face flushed. She stood, clutching the blueprint to her chest. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean. Where's your parent?" Ethan came running, his uniform damp with sweat, his breath short. He'd been 2 floors down when someone told him his daughter had wandered off. Panic had gripped his chest the whole way up. "I'm sorry, ma'am. She won't. She won't." "What? Wander into a $1 million facility again?" Veronica's gaze swept over him, cold and dismissive. She took in his uniform, the mop and bucket he'd left by the door, the calluses on his hands. "You think mopping floors in a hangar will get you back into the sky?" The words hung in the air like a blade. The room fell silent. Other workers nearby stopped, pretending not to listen. Someone chuckled. Another coughed to hide a laugh. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His hands curled into fists at his sides, then slowly relaxed. He'd learned a long time ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. Not here. Not in front of Lila. He took his daughter's hand, gently pulling the blueprint from her fingers and setting it on a nearby table. "Come on, kiddo. Let's go." As they walked toward the exit, Lila whispered, "Dad, you used to fly, didn't you?" He looked down at her, his throat tight. "Yeah, kiddo, but now, I just need you to live in a world that still has skies." She didn't understand, but she squeezed his hand anyway. That night, Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the shadow of his right arm in the dim light. The tattoo was still there, hidden beneath his long sleeves, a pair of iron wings with the words, "Wings of Valor," inscribed below. He hadn't looked at it in months. It reminded him of everything he'd lost. The sky. Sarah. The version of himself that believed he mattered. But it also reminded him of everything he'd saved. His wingman, Sterling Pierce. The rescue team in the sandstorm. He pulled his sleeve down and went to check on Lila. She was asleep, her notebook open on her chest, a half-finished drawing of a jet engine visible in the moonlight. He kissed her forehead and closed the notebook gently. "You'll fly one day," he whispered. "With your wings. And mine." Marcus Hale was a veteran engineer at Vanguard, 63 years old, with a limp from a helicopter crash in the 80s. He'd seen a lot of faces come and go, but something about Ethan Cole stuck with him. One afternoon, Marcus was walking past the maintenance bay when he saw Ethan crouched near a workbench, tightening a loose bolt on a dolly. The way he moved, precise, methodical, efficient, reminded Marcus of someone. Not a maintenance worker. A pilot. That night, Marcus pulled out an old photo from his desk drawer. It was a group shot from a military gala in 2012, honoring the Valor Squadron after a classified rescue mission in the Middle East. The photo was grainy, the faces half-shadowed by formal lighting, but Marcus had been there. He'd shaken hands with every pilot in that room. He squinted at the faces. Then his eyes widened. Third from the left. Same build, same jawline, same eyes. The man in the photo wore a dress uniform, medals across his chest, a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The man in the hangar wore a janitor's uniform, moved like a ghost, and never smiled at all. But Marcus knew. He'd seen enough men carry that weight to recognize it. The next morning, Marcus approached a younger colleague named Jenny in the break room. She was scrolling through her phone, barely paying attention, as he poured coffee. "You ever hear about the Valor pilots?" he asked quietly. Jenny shrugged. "Vaguely." Weren't they all killed in some mission? That's what they said. Desert Storm 2. Off the books. Supposedly the whole squadron went down over Nevada during a training accident. He nodded toward the hangar where Ethan was working. But I don't think they all died. Jenny frowned, finally looking up. The janitor? Look at him. The way he moves. The way he looks at the jets. That's not a man who just cleans. That's a man who flew. She laughed, but it was uncertain. Come on, Marcus. If he was some war hero, why would he be mopping floors? Maybe because heroes don't always get happy endings. The rumor spread quietly, like smoke under a door. People started watching Ethan differently, some with curiosity, others with doubt. A few of the older engineers began to whisper in the hallways, pulling up old news articles on their phones, comparing dates and faces. One even found a declassified mission report that mentioned the Valor Squadron's final operation, but all the names were redacted. Veronica heard the whispers during a budget meeting. She was halfway through a presentation on quarterly projections when one of the junior executives leaned over and muttered something to his neighbor. She caught the words janitor and pilot and slammed her hand on the table. The room fell silent. Are we seriously talking about a janitor being some kind of war hero? This is a corporation, not a fantasy novel. The executive cleared his throat. I just thought, you thought wrong. Get back to work. But the words stuck in her mind. That evening, she found herself standing in her father's old office, looking at a photograph on the wall. It showed her father, 20 years younger, shaking hands with a young pilot in a flight suit. The pilot's face was blurred by motion, but the insignia on his chest was clear. Valor Squadron. Her father had never talked much about that day. She'd asked once, when she was a teenager, and he'd only said that a pilot had saved his life during an emergency landing in Nevada. A pilot who refused a medal and disappeared. Veronica stared at the photo for a long time, her arms crossed, her reflection ghostly in the glass. She thought about Ethan's face, the way he'd looked at her when she insulted him, not with anger, with something quieter, sadness. Then she turned and walked away. It couldn't be him. People like Ethan Cole didn't become heroes. They became invisible. The crisis hit on a Friday. Vanguard's new prototype engine, the Apex 7, designed to revolutionize fuel efficiency in military jets, was scheduled for a live demonstration in front of defense contractors, journalists, and a delegation from the Pentagon. It was Veronica's chance to prove the company's dominance, to silence the board members who doubted her, to show the world that she was more than her father's daughter. She'd spent 3 months preparing for this moment. But during the pre-launch test, the pressure readings spiked. The combustion chamber was destabilizing, fluctuating wildly between safe and critical levels. Engineers crowded around the monitors, arguing in technical jargon, their voices rising in panic. Veronica stood at the center, her arms crossed, her face a mask of control. Inside, her heart hammered. Fix it. Now. One of the lead engineers shook his head. We don't know what's wrong, Miss Pierce. The specs are perfect. We've triple-checked every component. Then check again. We don't have time. The demonstration is in 6 hours. Veronica's jaw tightened. Canceling would be a disaster. The contracts, the press, the reputation, it would all collapse. She turned to the head of engineering. Run a diagnostic on every valve and sensor. Find the problem. Ethan was mopping the floor 20 feet away, near the back wall of the testing facility. He'd learned to make himself invisible during these high-stress moments, to move quietly and avoid eye contact. But he couldn't help glancing at the screen. The schematic was projected on the wall, large and detailed. He saw it immediately. The second exhaust valve was reversed. It would create a feedback loop at high altitude, destabilizing the chamber and potentially causing a catastrophic failure at 20,000 feet. Exactly the kind of mistake that killed pilots. He hesitated. This wasn't his place. He was a janitor. He had no authority, no credentials, no reason to speak. But then he thought of Lila, drawing airplanes in her notebook. He thought of the pilots who would fly this engine if it went into production. He thought of his wingman, the one he'd saved, the one who got to go home to his family because Ethan stayed. He set down his mop and stepped forward. "Excuse me." Veronica turned, her eyes flashing with irritation. "What?" "The second exhaust valve. It's reversed. That's why the pressure's uneven. It'll fail at altitude." The room went silent. Engineers stared at him. A few exchanged glances. One laughed nervously. Veronica's expression darkened. She took a step toward him, her voice low and dangerous. "I don't need a lesson from someone who mops floors." But Marcus was already pulling up the valve diagram on his tablet, his fingers moving quickly. His face went pale. "He's right." Veronica turned sharply. "What?" "The installation team reversed the flow direction. Look." He held up the tablet, showing the schematic overlaid with the actual installation photos. The valve was backwards. If they launched this, the engine would blow at 20,000 feet. Maybe higher, maybe lower, but it would blow. Veronica stared at the screen, her breath catching. The lead engineer confirmed it 3 minutes later, his voice shaking. They had 48 hours to fix it before the demonstration. The room erupted into motion. Engineers scattered, grabbing tools, pulling up schematics, shouting instructions. Veronica stood frozen for a moment, then turned to Ethan. He was already walking back to his mop. "Wait." He stopped but didn't turn around. "How did you know that?" Ethan glanced over his shoulder. "Lucky guess." He picked up his mop and walked away. But Marcus watched him go, and his suspicion solidified into certainty. That wasn't luck. That was years of flight experience. That was someone who'd lived at 20,000 feet and knew every system that could kill you up there. That was someone who'd flown. The demonstration day arrived under a steel-gray sky. The hangar was packed with contractors, reporters, military officials in dress uniforms, and a senator from the Armed Services Committee. The Apex 7 engine sat mounted on a test rig, gleaming under the industrial lights, its polished surface reflecting the faces of everyone who'd bet their careers on it. Veronica stood at the podium, delivering her speech with the confidence of someone who'd fought for every word. Her voice was steady, her posture perfect. She talked about innovation, about American engineering, about the future of aviation. She didn't mention the 48 sleepless hours her team had just endured. She didn't mention the janitor who'd saved them. Then the test began. The engine roared to life, a sound that shook the walls and rattled the windows. It was deafening, beautiful, a symphony of controlled explosion and precision engineering. The contractors nodded approvingly. The journalists took notes. The senator leaned forward, impressed. For 90 seconds, everything was perfect. The pressure held steady. The fuel burn was efficient. The thrust output exceeded projections. Veronica allowed herself a small smile. Then the pressure gauge spiked. Red lights flashed across the control panel. An alarm shrieked. Smoke poured from the combustion chamber, thick and black, billowing upward like a living thing. Sparks exploded outward, and suddenly the test rig was engulfed in flames. People screamed. Security rushed forward, shouting orders. The sprinkler system activated, but it wasn't enough. The fire spread to the fuel line, and a second explosion rocked the hangar. And through the chaos, Ethan saw a young engineer named Kyle, trapped behind the rig, his leg caught under a fallen support beam. The flames were spreading fast, crawling across the floor like fingers reaching for him. Kyle was screaming, pulling at his leg, his face twisted in pain and terror. Ethan didn't think. He ran. Veronica shouted after him, but he didn't hear. He vaulted over a barricade, grabbed a fire extinguisher off the wall, and sprayed a path through the flames. The heat was overwhelming, pressing against his skin like a physical force. His lungs burned, his eyes watered, but he kept moving. He reached Kyle, who was coughing, his face streaked with soot and tears. "I got you," Ethan said. He lifted the beam with a strength that sent pain shooting through his back, the old injury screaming in protest. Kyle scrambled free, clutching his leg. Ethan pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around the young man's shoulders, shielding him from the heat as they stumbled toward the exit. The fire suppression system kicked in. Foam and water rained down, dousing the flames. Emergency crews swarmed in, their voices loud and commanding, and as Ethan laid Kyle down on the floor outside the hangar, his jacket fell open. His right sleeve had torn in the chaos, ripped from shoulder to elbow. There, on his forearm, stark against his skin, was the tattoo. A pair of iron wings. Sharp and unmistakable, with the words, "Wings of Valor" inscribed beneath. The room fell silent. People stopped moving. A reporter gasped, her camera forgotten in her hands. "That's the Valor insignia." Marcus stepped forward, his voice shaking. "That's the squadron, the ones who were declared missing in Nevada." Another engineer, older, with gray hair and a limp, pointed at Ethan. "I knew it. I knew I'd seen him before." A journalist pulled out her phone, searching frantically, then held up a screen showing a grainy photo from 2012. The faces were blurred, but the insignia was clear. The Valor Squadron. They were heroes. They saved a civilian rescue team during a sandstorm and were presumed dead when their jets went down. Veronica stood frozen, her face pale. The photo in her father's office flashed in her mind. The pilot who saved him. The one who disappeared. She looked at Ethan, really looked at him for the first time, and she saw it. The scars, the way he carried himself. The quiet strength that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with survival. Her father's words echoed in her memory, words she dismissed as sentimentality. "He didn't want a medal, he just wanted to go home," she whispered, barely audible over the noise of the crowd. "It's you." The hangar emptied slowly. Paramedics took Kyle to the hospital. Reporters were ushered out by security, their questions unanswered, their cameras still flashing. The senator left without a word, his expression unreadable. Veronica dismissed everyone except Marcus, her voice hoarse from smoke and exhaustion. Then she walked to the maintenance bay where Ethan sat on a bench, stitching his torn jacket with a needle and thread. His movements were careful, practiced. His daughter's shoe lay beside him, the sole coming loose. He was fixing that next. Veronica stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. But her voice was different now. Softer. Uncertain. "Why didn't you tell anyone who you were?" Ethan didn't look up. His needle moved through the fabric in steady, even strokes. "Because titles don't save lives. I just wanted to teach my daughter that courage doesn't need an audience." Veronica stepped closer, her heels clicking softly on the concrete. "You saved my father. 15 years ago. Emergency landing in Nevada. Sandstorm. Rescue team trapped." He nodded slowly, still focused on his stitching. "Sterling Pierce. Good man. Told me to take the medal. I told him to give it to someone who needed it more." She sat down on the bench beside him, the CEO vanishing, replaced by someone smaller, more human. Her hands shook slightly, and she clasped them together to hide it. "I've spent 6 months trying to prove I'm strong enough to run this company. I thought strength meant never falling, never showing weakness, never letting anyone see me afraid." She paused, her voice breaking. "But you fell, and you're still here. Still saving people. How?" Ethan finally looked at her. His eyes were tired, but kind. "Strength isn't staying in the sky, Miss Pierce. It's knowing when to come down for someone else." The words hit her like a physical blow. For the first time in years, Veronica felt the weight she'd been carrying crack open. Tears filled her eyes, and she didn't stop them. They ran down her cheeks, smudging her makeup. And she didn't care. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what I said. For how I treated you. For everything." Ethan tied off the thread and set the jacket aside. "You were scared. I know what that looks like. I've been scared every day since I stopped flying. Then why do you stay here? Why work in a place that reminds you of what you lost?" "Because my daughter needs to see that even when you lose your wings, you don't lose your sky." Veronica nodded, her throat tight. They sat in silence for a long moment. Two people who'd been flying alone for too long, finally landing in the same place. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the runway. "What happens now?" she asked. Ethan picked up Lila's shoe and began stitching the sole. Now you decide what kind of leader you want to be. The kind who pushes people down to stay on top, or the kind who lifts people up so everyone can fly. Veronica wiped her eyes and stood. I want to be the second kind. Then let's start tomorrow. 3 days later, Lila was sitting in the hangar again, drawing in her notebook while Ethan worked nearby. She was sketching a new design, something she called a family plane with extra seats and windows, big enough to see the stars. The hangar was quieter now, the chaos of the demonstration behind them, but the damage remained scorch marks on the walls, a charred section of floor waiting for repairs. Lila hummed to herself, lost in her drawing. Above her, a cable snapped. It was an accident, a frayed line on a pulley system overhead, weakened by the heat from the fire days earlier. No one had noticed it during the cleanup. The metal hook swung down like a pendulum, striking a toolbox near where Lila sat. The box tipped, tools scattering across the concrete with a deafening clatter. Lila jumped back, startled, but her foot caught on a loose panel. She fell hard, her wrist twisting beneath her as she hit the ground. She cried out, a sharp, frightened sound that cut through the noise of the hangar. Ethan was across the building, speaking with Marcus about safety protocols. He heard the crash, heard his daughter's cry, and his world narrowed to a single point. He ran, his heart pounding, his old injury forgotten. But Veronica was closer. She'd been walking through the hangar, inspecting the repairs. When she heard the crash, she didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees beside Lila, pulling the little girl into her arms. It's okay. You're okay. I've got you. Lila sobbed, clutching her wrist. Tears streamed down her face, and her whole body shook. Veronica's hands trembled as she checked for injuries, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. This is my fault. The cable should have been replaced. I should have. Ethan arrived, breathless. He knelt beside them, his hand on Lila's shoulder, but he didn't pull her away from Veronica. He saw the tears on the CEO's face, the way she held his daughter like she was something precious and fragile, like she mattered more than anything else in the world. Let me see, kiddo, he said gently. Lila turned to him, her face red and tear-streaked. It hurts, Dad. He examined her wrist carefully. It was swollen, but not broken. Probably a sprain. You're going to be okay. We'll get you checked out, but you're tough, just like your mom. Veronica looked up at him, her mascara streaked, her carefully constructed armor completely gone. I was wrong. About everything. Jets aren't just built with steel. They're built with the hearts of people who've flown. And I forgot that. I forgot what matters. Ethan's voice was gentle. It's hard to remember when you're fighting, just to stay in the air. She nodded, her grip on Lila softening as the paramedics arrived. They confirmed it was a sprain. Nothing serious. But they wanted to take her to the hospital for x-rays, just to be safe. Veronica didn't let go until Lila smiled at her. You're really nice when you're not yelling, Lila said. Veronica laughed through her tears, a sound that surprised even herself. I'll work on that. As they walked Lila to the ambulance, Ethan glanced at Veronica. Thank you for being there. She met his eyes, and for the first time, there was no barrier between them. No hierarchy, no judgment, just two people who'd learned what it meant to fall and get back up. Thank you for showing me what being there actually means. The press conference was held the following Monday. Veronica stood at the podium in the main conference room, cameras flashing, reporters waiting with pens poised over notebooks. She wore a simple suit, navy blue instead of her usual black, her hair pulled back, her face composed but open. No more masks. 6 months ago, I took over this company determined to prove I was strong enough. I fired people who didn't meet my standards. I dismissed voices that didn't sound like power, and I insulted a man who turned out to be the person who saved my father's life. She paused, letting the words settle. The room was completely silent. Ethan Cole is a hero, not because of the medals he refused, but because he chose to stay on the ground to raise his daughter. Because he saved lives without needing credit. Because he showed me that strength isn't about never falling. It's about who you lift up when you do. The reporters leaned forward, their cameras clicking. She continued, her voice stronger now. Effective today, I'm appointing Ethan Cole as Honorary Safety Advisor for Vanguard Aerospace. He'll oversee flight safety training and mentor our engineers in the values of the Valor Squadron: integrity, courage, and service above self. Applause erupted, filling the room. But when the reporters rushed forward to interview Ethan, who stood at the back of the room in a borrowed suit, he stepped back. I don't need a title, Miss Pierce. The room fell silent again. Veronica turned to him, surprised. Then what do you need? A classroom. A space where kids like my daughter, kids who can't afford flight school, kids whose parents work 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, can learn about aviation. That's the real legacy. Not medals, not press conferences, teaching the next generation to fly. Veronica smiled, and for the first time, it reached her eyes. It was genuine, unguarded, the smile of someone who'd found something she didn't know she was looking for. Then we'll build it. Together. The reporters erupted with questions. But Veronica raised her hand. One more thing. This foundation won't just bear the Valor name. It'll be funded by a portion of Vanguard's profits every year. Because if we're going to build planes that touch the sky, we need to build people who remember why the sky matters. The next day, construction began on a new wing of the Vanguard facility. A learning center with flight simulators, workshop spaces, and a scholarship fund for underprivileged children. They called it the Valor Foundation. And Ethan stood in the empty room, imagining the children who would one day fill it, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. 1 year later, the Valor Foundation opened its doors on a bright Saturday morning. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was smaller than the demonstration had been, more intimate, but somehow more important. Lila stood at the front, holding oversized scissors that were almost as big as she was, her wrist fully healed, a proud smile on her face. Ethan stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, wearing a button-down shirt instead of his janitor's uniform. Veronica stood on the other side, no longer the untouchable CEO, but someone who'd learned to land, to be human, to lead with her heart instead of her armor. Behind them, a new jet prototype gleamed on the tarmac, painted with the Iron Wings insignia, and the words, Wings of Valor, along its fuselage. The press called it the Plane of Faith, a symbol of Vanguard's rebirth under Veronica's transformed leadership. The company's stock had climbed steadily over the past year, but more importantly, morale had soared. People wanted to work there now, not out of fear, but out of pride. 50 children from underserved communities filled the hangar, their eyes wide as Marcus and the other engineers explained thrust, lift, drag, and dreams. They were kids from neighborhoods where college seemed impossible, where the sky was just something above the buildings, not a place you could actually go. One little boy, no more than 9, raised his hand. Can anyone learn to fly? Ethan crouched down to meet his eyes, the same way he did with Lila every night. Anyone who's willing to fall first. The boy grinned, his front teeth missing, his future suddenly bigger than it had been 5 minutes ago. As the sun set, casting orange and gold light across the runway, Ethan walked out to the new jet. He ran his hand along the fuselage, feeling the cool metal under his fingers, the rivets and seams and promise of flight. Veronica joined him, her heels replaced with sneakers, her blazer gone, just a simple blouse and jeans. Do you ever miss it? Flying? He nodded. Every day. But I found something better. What's that? A reason to stay grounded. She smiled, and it was the smile of someone who understood. You know, my father used to say that the best pilots aren't the ones who fly the highest. They're the ones who bring everyone home. Ethan looked at her. Really looked at her. And saw the woman she'd become. Your father was a wise man. He learned it from you. They stood in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and purple. Inside the hangar, children laughed and dreamed. And for the first time in a long time, neither Ethan nor Veronica felt alone. They'd both fallen. They'd both learned to fly again, just in a different way. The evening grew quiet now. The children had gone home with their parents, clutching brochures and scholarship applications and dreams that felt suddenly possible. The hangar lights dimmed to a soft glow. The engineers packed up their demonstrations. The day's excitement settled into a peaceful stillness. Ethan walked to the edge of the runway, the wind cool against his face, carrying the scent of jet fuel and possibility. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing the tattoo fully, the iron wings. Still sharp after all these years. Still proud. The ink had faded slightly, but the meaning hadn't. It never would. Veronica approached slowly, her footsteps soft on the concrete. She looked different in the fading light. Softer. Real. The person she'd been hiding for so long, finally allowed to exist. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure. Why didn't you hate me when I insulted you?" He shook his head, a slight smile on his face. "I didn't hate you. I saw myself." She frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "You were terrified of falling. So you pushed everyone else down first. Made them small, so you could feel big. I did the same thing after I lost my wings. I pushed away everyone who tried to help, my friends, my therapist, even Sarah for a while, until Lila reminded me that falling doesn't mean you're broken. It just means you're human." Veronica's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they weren't from grief or shame. They were from relief, from the unbearable lightness of finally being seen. "I don't know how to be human anymore," she whispered. "I forgot somewhere along the way." Ethan turned to her, his expression gentle. "Then let me teach you, the same way you're teaching me to build again. To hope again." She looked at him, and something passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but the beginning of something deeper. Trust, partnership, understanding. A shared sky where both of them could finally breathe. "Deal," she said. He reached out his hand. She took it. Above them, the jet's engines hummed softly in the evening air, the iron wings painted on its side catching the last light of day, glowing like embers. It wasn't just a plane anymore. It was a promise. A legacy. A reminder that even when you fall, you can still teach others to fly. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you find someone willing to fly with you. Ethan looked up at the sky, at the first stars beginning to appear, and thought of Sarah. He thought of the missions he'd flown, the lives he'd saved, the man he used to be, and he realized something he'd been too afraid to admit for years. He hadn't lost his wings. He'd just learned to use them differently. To lift his daughter up, to catch Veronica when she fell, to build something that would outlast any flight he'd ever taken. "You ready to go home?" Veronica asked. Ethan smiled. "Yeah, let's go home."